Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Standard of Care webinar on resilient design. As you get settled, a few reminders before we get started. AIA California sincerely acknowledges the professional expertise our volunteer presenters provide. We greatly appreciate the diversity of perspectives and recognize that items presented in today's session may elicit a variety of responses. We strongly encourage attendees to be constructive in their comments and questions to the presenter and to one another to ensure we have a session that is productive and an environment that is a positive experience for everyone. Additionally, please do not use the chat box to ask questions for today's panelists. Instead, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. With the Q&A function, attendees can like a question to move it to the top of the queue. And as always, the webinar content is being recorded today and additional resources will be made available online shortly after the session. Today's webinar is focused on how standard of care is both defined and discussed against the backdrop of resilient design and qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW Learning Unit for those who stay on and watch live. AIA California staff will report the units for you once you have finished the session. Now to introduce our speaker. Brett Stewart, JD, is the manager of the Loss Prevention and Education Department for the Design Professional Unit of AXA XL. He is responsible for leading the effort to develop risk management and educational materials for AXA XL's design professional insureds to help firms manage their liability and business risks. Brett interfaces directly with architects and engineers, brokers, and various industry organizations to promote issues that are relevant to the design community. Thank you so much for being here today, Brett. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you much. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to AIA California for the opportunity to present this program. Let me go ahead and share my screen here real quick. 1 second. And I will go ahead and get this up and running. Okay, there we go. So our topic is resilient design and evolving standard of care. As Sarah introduced me, I am the manager of our loss prevention and client education group at AXA XL Design Professional. We insure architects and engineers, and we are now part of the AXA family. We were purchased by AXA Insurance a few years back, which makes us now second largest commercial carrier in the world. I wanted to talk to you about this topic that's generating a lot of discussion in the design space, as many of you may know by now. And that is the standard of care and how that is being impacted by a changing climate, by more severe weather events, for example. And it's important to realize this from a liability standpoint. We are concerned about how this is going to increase exposure for our design professionals as we're going forward. We're not ever going to see any lawsuits or any causes of action for a, climate change. We're talking about a breach of the standard of care, your professional obligations, and these things can be made worse by the things that are going on in the world around us. So I want to go ahead and kick it off, give you a little bit of an agenda. Before I get into this, though, it's fair to say that my background is claims and litigation. So I was a lawyer at 2 San Francisco law firms for 8 years, representing contractors and design professionals. And then I handled professional liability claims for about 7 years. And prior to all that, I was handling general liability claims for contractors. So I've been in this space when it comes to sort of dealing with problems. I'm not an architect. I've never practiced architecture or engineering. So I don't want to hold myself out as someone who does what you do. And I always want to temper my message a little bit because I understand that, all the things that I've seen in my professional, in my professional practice have really centered around disputes and litigation and problems. So a lot of the things that I'm going to approach today are talking about, litigation avoidance, litigation mitigation, trying to, mitigate the impact and the size and the frequency of claims. But at the end of the day, the thing that I don't want to lose focus of is we're all after the same thing, and that's that is a successful project. And it's important that, to put the message that I have into context. The vast majority of your projects do not wind up in claim territory or in litigation, but we need to approach our projects as if they might. And when we're looking at a changing climate, when we're looking at more severe weather events, and I'll talk about some of the other factors in our program today that can amplify claims for us, we need to be mindful about that. When I talk to firms about risk management, it's really the aggregation of all these little things that at the end of the day might make anywhere from a modest to a significant difference when it comes to to a claim and how we might be able to mitigate the impact of that. So it's your daily practice that really matters. And in doing that, it's that daily practice that's going to increase your communications with clients. It's going to lead to more successful projects. It's going to generate more work for you in the future. So as we go through this program today, I just want to temper my own message. I don't want to be overly negative, but just keep in mind a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, I have viewed through the lens of claims and litigation. So here's a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going today. We're going to talk briefly about resilient design and why do we need it. I don't want to spend a ton of time discussing it, but it's important as we set the stage to sort of understand what are the factors that might weigh in terms of developing the standard of care and what you knew or should have known. I'll talk about the standard of care, and then we'll talk about identifying the problem, hazard identification, for example, and then some solutions, hopefully some things that you can take with you in your own practice. It's my intention or my hope today that we'll talk about some things that are kind of probably reinforce a lot of what it is that you're doing and maybe just give you a little bit of a different perspective. Some of the slides are really designed to kind of generate more of a big picture understanding of some of the things that are going on around us that can impact this analysis of the standard of care and what that means. So what is resilient design and why do we need it? The things that I'm going to talk about today when it comes to resilience really relate to climate and severe weather events. So sea level rise, storm surge, extreme weather, heat, cold, wind, rain, fire, flood, landslide. We can also talk about resilience from the standpoint of earthquake design, from combating or addressing pandemic and disease and civil unrest and war. These are all things that might work into your design practice when it comes to resilience, but we're not really going to address those in today's webinar. When we talk about resilient design, and this is from the Resilient Design Institute, the intentional design of buildings, landscapes, communities, and regions in order to respond to natural and man-made disasters and disturbances. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are how do we make our projects more resilient? How can they recover quicker, either mitigate the impact of extreme weather or recover quicker from natural disaster? So just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I've got a couple slides with some graphs here. This is not a program to convince people that climate change is real. And I will say, when I developed this program, certainly, going back 4 or 5 years, I had to be very careful. We underwrite firms all across North America, United States, and Canada. And depending on where you were at the time, 4 or 5 years ago, you had to be careful how you positioned the statement about climate change. We've evolved a lot in the last 4 or 5 years, and we're talking about climate change as something that is happening. When we look at these stats, 98% of publishing scientists agree that human activities are causing the planet to warm. Now, what we're finding is all the models and the science and the data and the information, it is evolving over time. It's getting more precise. But this graph here, this is taking a look at the atmospheric samples of ice cores. So we're looking at CO2 in the atmosphere. This is looking at ice cores. This is going back 800,000 years. And what you see is these temperature swings, or these CO2 swings in the atmosphere. And this is going over, ice ages, looking at these different ice ages that have occurred over the last 800,000 years, and looking at the CO2. And what you see is all of a sudden around, basically starting around 1880 in the Industrial Revolution, there is a spike in CO2 levels that's happening, we're seeing in the atmosphere. And the current levels are up over 400 parts per million, whereas the highest was probably around 330 or 300. So there's something that is going on in the atmosphere, and a lot of publishing scientists, the vast majority of scientists, believe that it has to do with human activities, the creation of greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. Now, this is looking at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and they've taken 4 different models, and they're looking at temperature anomalies. They're looking at an increase in degrees centigrade. And this is going back to 1880. And what we're finding is around 1950, there is a pretty big uptick in in the temperature of the planet. And of course, it is cyclical. It goes up and down, but the overall trend is it is going up. There is actually a more refined graph on this I didn't include today. I think it includes 2 more models, and they all track almost exactly the same. And the reason that I want to show these is to the extent, not necessarily to convince people that it is happening, but there's an overwhelming amount of science that is supporting the notion that human activities are causing the planet to warm. And when we talk about the standard of care and informing that decision and the things that we want to do with it, just understand that there is this baseline information that strongly supports the proposition that it is happening. Now, this is taking a look at a 50-year trend in insured losses. This is from, I believe this is the Swiss Re Institute. They publish information on this. Swiss Re is an insurer and reinsurer. They publish this information out there. All the graphs you're seeing that we have the permission to use these. But I like this graph because it looks at 50 years. It goes up through 2021. The data from 2022 isn't all in yet. But take a look at this. It breaks it down between man-made. So you can see 2001, that big pink bar, that's primarily the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Then you've got weather-related and then earthquake, tsunami. So earthquake, tsunami, 2011, you can see the Japan earthquake. But we're really focused a lot on that green bar that shows up in here. And you can see where we've had some of these natural catastrophes that are driving this, catastrophe losses, cat losses, as we call them in the industry. So 2005 had hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. We always think about Katrina, but there were two other big hurricanes that happened that year as well. The flooding in Thailand, that was a big piece of the earthquake related to that. And then 2017, hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And then looking at the losses that happened in, this is going back to last year, it's about $112 billion in catastrophe losses that happen worldwide. And a lot of that was driven by a number of different things, but we did have some hurricane activity that drove that as well. Hurricane Ida, I believe, hitting the Florida coast. So looking at 2021 and basically the fourth largest year in history when we're looking at insured losses. Now, this information, it's important to keep it into context. One of the reasons we are seeing, you can look at it and discount it and say, well, we're seeing more insured losses because you've got people living in more marginal zones, like coastal areas, areas that are prone to flooding and certainly be impacted by sea level rise. And you might have a situation where more people are insured now than they were before. All of the above is true. And it's important to realize, though, that the insured losses are going to drive a lot of the litigation that we're seeing. And this doesn't capture the uninsured losses. When we think about some of the hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, Maria, that were hitting the Caribbean back in 2017, there was a tremendous amount of uninsured property. So that is also something I don't want to focus too much on the insured piece of this. The uninsured piece is important as well. In the United States, we tend to have more or a higher rate of insured losses. But as we'll see, and we get into this program, that's not always going to be the case. There's going to be some shifts in the ability to insure property, especially here in California, and that can be an issue for you as a design professional. So when we think about kind of stepping back for a second, looking at this 30,000 foot view of what's going on around us, I think about it as sort of this perfect storm for claims against architects and engineers. So you've got increasing catastrophe losses. And while I was looking at the insured losses, it is a fact that we are seeing storms of greater severity that are happening. And it's not just the Category 5 hurricanes. Think about Hurricane Harvey that struck the Houston area. That was not a very powerful hurricane. It's just that it was a slow moving hurricane that dumped a tremendous amount of rain. Same thing happened last year in Fort Lauderdale, or earlier this year, I believe it was. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, I think 12 to 18 inches of rain in the course of a day or a half a day. Again, not a high wind event, just you've got these massive storms. There's a lot of energy in them and they're just moving slowly and parking over certain areas. So it doesn't have to be a Category 5 hurricane. So we are seeing a trend in, whether it's more assets that are exposed to extreme weather events. We're seeing more or weather events that are more extreme, not necessarily in terms of frequency, but certainly in terms of severity. And then we're also seeing where this is also overlaid at a time where we have really poor infrastructure. We have been kicking that can down the road for decades in terms of replacing and upgrading our bridges, our waterways, our roadways. All of these different things are going to have a toll. And now, we are starting to see more federal funding that's going to be in terms of infrastructure funding. We're starting to see it at a local level. In California, we recently passed the gas tax, so we were able to index that gas tax. I believe it was a 10-cent tax. That's going to help pay for some of these infrastructure upgrades as well. But what we're also seeing is property carriers are starting to avoid certain risks. So starting not in California, but in New Orleans, for example, we've had some pretty big homeowners carriers exiting that market altogether, saying we're just not going to insure homes in the city of New Orleans or other parishes throughout Louisiana. That's a huge problem, especially if people have a mortgage. They have to have homeowners insurance. The fallback, the state run government safety nets do not provide the same level of coverage. It's not a one-for-one trade on that, but you've got carriers that are pulling out of markets. We're seeing that happening in California. And I believe it was last week, State Farm, a large carrier in California, said that they were going to stop insuring property in California, not just certain areas. We were starting to see that happen already, like up in Lake Tahoe area, certain areas in the Bay Area, for example, or in Southern California that are near that wildland urban interface. Carriers are saying, we're just not going to insure that. State Farm is pulling out of that entirely. And apparently Allstate stopped writing property in California last year. And that just has certainly been reported as well. That matters, because if there's no insurance to pay for losses, it puts more emphasis on those folks who help design and construct these facilities. We're also starting to see federal programs like the National Flood Insurance Program being overhauled. It's a bigger deal if you live in Florida, because in Florida, they're starting to see folks are starting to have to pay rates based on the actual exposure. But it's quite possible we see these other government safety nets being overhauled as well, as the government's going to be saddled with more and more of a burden of paying for natural catastrophes. It's also getting a little bit more difficult to predict some of these events. Now, at the same time, we're also seeing this proliferation of models, whether it's hazard models, the ability to, some of them are using artificial intelligence. So tools that are being developed where we can sort of look around the corner and say, okay, what is the world going to look like in 20 years, 10 years, for example. But overall, seeing this trend of natural catastrophes with increasing severity, it's getting harder to predict these events. Just here in California, as we were getting ready to come into the wet season last fall, they were predicting, I guess it was a three-peat of the La Nina cycle. Now, I'm not a climatologist, but typically that La Nina cycle tends to be drier. The El Nino tends to be wetter, and there's a lot more that goes into it than that. And then what ended up happening is we had perhaps our wettest year on record. So in terms of predicting what this is going to be like, the science is not totally exact yet. This is a hard thing to do. We've also got these changing climate patterns. I'm delivering this webinar right now from Walnut Creek, California. It is in early June and it's 64 degrees out. It should be 30 degrees hotter right now. We are definitely seeing some unpredictable weather that's going on around us. And that can also translate into climate patterns that are changing over the long run. Climate meaning that long-term pattern of weather. And then the other thing that makes this kind of difficult for some of our design professionals is this notion that if something goes wrong, somebody has to pay for it. That to me is probably the biggest issue. We live in a society where if there's damage or harm that happens, it has to be somebody's fault. And there is some truth to that on one level, but when we're starting to see extreme weather driving these natural catastrophes, we're going to start seeing things happening to people that was unavoidable. It is not, you can't just look at every project and say, well, we have to design this to 1,000-year event, 1,000-year rain event, 1,000-year flood event. I mean, ask our engineers, they can totally do that. You just might not like the way the building looks and it might cost an awful lot. But this notion that somebody has to pay for it, this gets into the whole litigation piece of this. And this is definitely causing an increase in claim severity. When we look at, we track all of our claims and we look at our payouts, we are seeing a huge spike in damage awards going on right now. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in this program, but this is one of the things that is impacting this. And it's one of the things that's impacting the decision of State Farm to pull out of California. They were having trouble predicting some of these weather-related events, in particular fire. The cost to rebuild has become pretty astronomical over the last couple of years. And then we live at a time where people are going to file a lawsuit if something bad happens. So let's transition a little bit to the standard of care. When we talk about the standard of care, we talk a lot about the common law standard of care. I've put a definition up here. I think this is from our contract guide. We have a contract guide for design professionals, but this language is very similar to what you'll find in the AIA agreements. And it's basically what it says is, the standard you're going to be held to is what somebody else practicing at the same time in the same location under the same circumstances would have. What would your competitor down the street be held to? What standard if they were working on the same type of project at the same point in time? You'll perform in a manner consistent with that degree of care and skill ordinarily exercised by the members of the same profession, currently practicing under similar circumstances at the same time in the same or similar locality. There's a lot of different variations of this, but the gist of it is we want to be doing, whatever that standard is based on our competition, our cohorts, our colleagues, what are they doing at the same point in time? Where we get into trouble with this is we start seeing contractual requirements that elevate that standard of care. And I see this a lot in the contracts that we review. You're going to provide best in class. You're going to design a legacy project. It's going to be award-winning, nationally recognized design, cutting edge, highest standards, first-class design. We also see requirements where an architect might have to guarantee project performance. I guarantee you that this project will be LEED Silver. That's a tough promise to make because a lot of things go into a project achieving LEED Silver, and a lot of that is outside of your control. I also see these standard of care clauses show up in contracts where it says that you, the architect, are going to put the client's interest above all else. Isn't that nice? That is a fiduciary obligation. It conflicts directly with your ethical obligations. It is the highest standard that you can owe to a client. It is that of maybe a financial advisor. So be very mindful about what goes into your contract. The reason I say this is if you get pulled into a claim, we want to be able to have this battle of the experts. You might have heard us talk about that before. People in either insurance or litigation, they're going to get an expert to say you did everything wrong. We're going to find somebody, and we don't just hire hired guns. If you did something wrong, we're going to pay the claim. But we're going to find somebody who's going to be objective, is going to say, well, look, either what this architect did wasn't that bad, or what they did was actually reasonable under the circumstances. But if you have an elevated standard of care provision in your contract, we can't have that fight. It's very hard to do it. So what I've done here, just to kind of drive home this point about the standard of care and what it means, is this is a sample jury instruction. This comes from the California Civil Jury Instructions 600. So if you've if you've ever been through a trial, what will happen is shortly before trial, we'll have our motions in limine and our pretrial motions, and we'll be fighting over things like jury instructions. And there are these templates, these sample forms, and we'll be able to use these. You don't get them rubber stamped necessarily, but these are things that you'll be introducing, hopefully, to a jury. So at the conclusion of the trial, the judge will provide these instructions to a jury. And I like this because when we have a claim, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is, what are 12 people in that jury box going to do in terms of deciding your fate? People who have probably very little experience designing and constructing anything. They come from all walks of life. If you've been to jury duty, it's a pretty fascinating experience, and you meet people who had they're completely different. And that's what makes our jury system so unique, is you've got people who are from all walks of life. So when we talk about a jury of our peers, it's from people in your community. It's not a jury of architects or engineers or contractors. But I like what this language says. An architect is negligent if he or she fails to use the skill and care that a reasonably careful architect would have used in similar circumstances, right? What would that person down the street do? And that you're negligent only if you were not as skillful, knowledgeable, or careful as another reasonable architect. It says an architect is not necessarily negligent just because his or her efforts are unsuccessful or he or she makes an error that was reasonable under the circumstances. When we talk about the standard of care and how it is evolving, certainly when it comes to designing resilient projects in dealing with climate change and severe weather, the important thing to realize is absent a clause in your contract where you agree to an elevated standard of care, you don't have to get it right. Now, that can be a tough sell sometimes for a jury. Hey, folks, bad things happen to good people, and that's just the way life works. That's a difficult argument to make sometimes, but it's better than saying, I promised the moon and the stars and I didn't deliver. In that case, you're going to lose that case, and we may never see the inside of a courtroom because hopefully your carrier and your attorney is going to sit down with you and we're going to figure out a way to settle it. So when I talk about the standard of care constantly evolving, it's always been evolving. I mean, that's one of the things that makes your job so unique. And it changes based on a lot of different things. So think about the prevailing scientific understanding, data, media reports, your experiences, the experiences of your colleagues and your peers. All of these things inform the standard of care. Now, I've delivered this program before, and I've had somebody come up to me afterwards and they say, well, wait a minute. If I attended this program, does that now mean that I know more about the standard of care and I should do a better job? Well, at the end of the day, the more you know, it's going to help you in terms of avoiding a claim, in terms of mitigating or avoiding liability in a claim. But the things that are going on around you, media reports, scientific data, all of these things, those all impact the standard of care. The standard of care isn't what necessarily what you think, it's what you think or a reasonable architect would think. So it is an objective standard. And I say that because I've been in situations where some folks just think, well, I'm not going to look at any of this stuff. I'm going to bury my head in the sand. That way they can't hang me on any of it. I don't want to hear this program. That's not going to help you. So when we think about, for example, what the AIA is doing, AIA California Council, really trying to get these issues out there and bring awareness to them, these are all things, that's out there in the universe. It's going to inform the standard of care. So the more of this information you can take in, the better off you're going to be. But it's incumbent upon you to stay up to speed on evolving codes and standards and laws and regulations. One of the things to keep in mind is that just complying with the code is not enough. Whether we're talking about resilient design, whatever it might be, code compliance is not necessarily the standard of care. And I know for some of our design professionals, they struggle with that concept quite a bit. But wait a minute, here's the building code. I did everything I was supposed to do, and you're telling me I can still get sued? The answer is yes, because code compliance is a floor. It might meet the standard of care, but it might not. And if we are sitting in a claim where we have another architect sitting across the table who's been hired to criticize your work, they're going to take pot shots at you and they're going to make that argument. Yeah, but you should have done more. Is that argument accurate? Well, it kind of depends. It depends on what other architects would have done at the same point in time. Similarly, just if a client comes to you and says, hey, here are my program requirements, go ahead and do it, that doesn't necessarily meet the standard of care. And ethically, you may have an obligation to discuss those program requirements with them and recommend more robust designs. But this can be tricky sometimes because think about some of your clients. You might be working with some clients who know very little about design and construction. They've hired you to be the expert. You tell me what to do. I know nothing about this project. I want a project that is going to stand the test of time. That can be very vague about what it is they want in terms of their outcomes. And it's up to you to kind of drill down on those issues and figure out what's important to them. But think about some of the more institutional clients who say, you know what, we take resilience and sustainability. This is a key component, a key goal. It's a shared goal. This is really important to us. Here are our program requirements. Just because they seem like they're on top of it doesn't mean that you can just accept them and adopt them blindly. You still have to go through this analysis and take a look at it and say, is this meeting their program requirements? And you've also got to be thinking about industry group standards as well. So here I have like EJCDC for engineers, but I put some information on here also, the AIA industry statement on resilience. The Resilience Project Process Guide, that is a tremendous resource along with the Resilience Design Toolkit. These are all on the AIA website under the Resilience page. You can download these. They are phenomenal resources. And what they do is they help you go through a project and sort of demystify What are the things I need to be thinking about? Who are the different project stakeholders that need to be part of this? What are some of the models and how do they apply and where do they fit into the design process? So take a look at these if you haven't had them. The Resilience Design Toolkit goes into a lot of, it has a lot of information on this. Now, this is a great place to start for your standard of care analysis. And I'll bet you certainly right now where we are in 2023, if you pulled these documents off the internet, studied them and incorporated this into your conversations with your clients, my guess is you have overwhelmingly met the standard of care. But the documents that are being published today, they might not be relevant or up to date 5 years from now, 2 years from now. So it's important that if you are using these as a benchmark to inform your decisions, and we'll talk about this in our communication and documentation piece of this later on, it's important that what you're doing is you are making a record of this, you're printing these things to a PDF, you know, you're putting these onto a project file so you can go back and recreate what it is that you looked at, what you relied on, what you did, the decisions that you made. This is going to help in terms of sort of setting what is that standard of care. And then I also want you to think about this last bullet point, and it's not going to feature too much in this program, but the notion that resilient design and sustainability may not be the same thing. There's a big push in cities, certainly in California, to decarbonize. And I think as we go down this path, we want to really combat global warming. We want to have this low carbon economy. We need to start decarbonizing, but just be mindful as a design professional, you've got to be asking yourself these questions about resilience and resilient design, because you have an ethical obligation to health, safety, and welfare. And to say, okay, we're going to decarbonize a community and no one's going to have any backup power. And thinking about those other things that I was showing on that slide, this 30,000 foot view of the other things that are happening around us, think about our failing infrastructure. Think what's been going on with PG&E, for example, and the fires, the Camp Fire, for example, that we had a few years back that killed 88 people. The rolling blackouts that we've had throughout California, the poor air quality. There may be something to be said about we've got to have backup power sources. So just be mindful of that as we're going through and we're talking about, you've got clients who are saying we've got to have these sustainability goals. You've got to be asking yourself the same questions as well about, okay, we have the sustainability, but how does this pair with our resilient design? How can we ensure that communities are going to be safe and can recover quickly from natural catastrophes? So we think about our code of ethics. You've got these different canons. They've got ethical standards and then rules. I don't want to go through all of your canons, but you see there's a number of different places that are important and can inform your decisions. I like to talk about ethics in this program just a little bit because sometimes your ethical obligation, first off, we want to make sure we're meeting our ethical obligation, but it's that type of, if we're having a difficult conversation with a client, how do we start that off? How do we set the stage for a conversation with a client that doesn't want to hear this project is going to cost more money? Sometimes saying, look, I have an ethical obligation, you know, ethical standard 6.5, you should incorporate adaptation strategies, you know, with clients to anticipate extreme weather events and minimize adverse effects on the environment, economy, and public health. That's all about resilience there. I got to have this conversation with you. We need to discuss it. Rule 6.501, members shall consider with their clients the environmental effects of their project decisions. So there are ethical requirements that you need to work into your designs and your conversations with clients. I can also tell you, and again, approaching this from a claims and litigation standpoint, when a lot of our insureds are trying to push back on some of these onerous contract clauses, like an elevated standard of care that says, I'm going to put my client's interest above all else, well, that can directly conflict with your ethical obligations to health, safety, and welfare. So keep that in mind as well. You have an obligation, I believe it is Rule 2.105. If in the course of your work on a project, you become aware of a decision taken by your client which violates the law or regulation, in your judgment, you might have to actually report them to the local building authority, for example. So we have these ethical obligations, and sometimes just being upfront about those obligations with a client can help manage expectations. And time permitting in this program, I'll mention that at the end when we talk about some contractual clauses we can put into our contract. Public responsibility, we have a chapter in our contract guide that addresses that very issue that basically just says to a client, look, I may have an obligation to report you. Now, nobody wants to see that, obviously, but it's about managing those expectations. So when I think about resilient design, there's really kind of 5 ways to think about it. And one is you've thought about it and everything worked out great. In which case, we're probably not even going to be discussing this. There's not going to be a claim. The other, probably the more common one, is you thought about it, but the client doesn't want to pay for it. Can you still get sued? Yes, you still can. You can get sued for any of these, but it comes down to having the conversation, documenting the conversation, raising the concerns that you have. I think back to the claims that I used to handle for architects and engineers. And it was in the 7 years or so that I did it, it was probably over 2,000 claims. So a pretty good sample size. And as I look back on that period in my career, I would say that one of the overwhelming themes that came out of claims was owners saying, I hired you to be the professional. I was relying on your expert skill and judgment. And there's something to be said about that. Yes, I've seen those claims where, for example, you have a client who's making all the bad decisions, telling you to go pound sand. They don't want to hear it. They get sued based on what they did. Now they try to pin it on you. That doesn't happen very often. It can happen. But more commonly, what happens is a client doesn't really understand what it is that they're doing. They need you to put the brakes on them. They need you to sort of give them some constraints and help them define their project and to be upfront with them about how a project's going to perform and life cycle analysis and all that. So there is truth to the fact that you are being hired as a professional and you owe that obligation to your client. So if the client doesn't want to pay for something, you've got to make a decision as to how to proceed on that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The other one is you thought about it, but your design didn't work. And that is okay. If we have that common law standard of care provision, remember what it said. You don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to work. You can fail. And if what you did was what another reasonable architect would have done under the same circumstances, well, that doesn't get you out of a lawsuit. We can't file a motion to dismiss, say, look, standard of care, but it gives us a very, very good footing in terms of going into a claim. And again, I'm going to hit this numerous times. So much of this can depend on the contract clauses in your agreement. Elevated standard of care, for example. The other one is you just didn't think about it. You missed the issue altogether, or you thought about it, but you didn't think it mattered. And that's where we can find some claim activity as well. If I didn't think about it, can I still get sued? Well, absolutely, because when we talk about the standard of care, it is an objective standard. What would your competitors down the street do? Now, it's possible you missed something altogether. It's possible that when you were designing something, you didn't think about a 1,000-year event. It's possible, there's a lot of conversation going on in California right now about mega floods. What's that going to look like? These, 1,000-year events, multi-1,000-year events. Look at what's happening right now in the Central Valley, Lake Tulare. Lake Tulare used to be a thing before we came along and drained it in the 1800s, but it was the fourth, I believe it was the, in terms of surface area, 4 times the size of Lake Tahoe, just north of Bakersfield. And now that lake is starting to fill up with all the runoff, with all the rain that we had, and we're sitting on this snowpack that thankfully is melting pretty slowly right now. But we may see more events like this as well. Can you get sued for that if it's an event that is so rare? Well, we're talking about these things now. So now it's working its way into the public space. But even if you did everything right, even if a client said, I don't want to pay you to design a project that's going to be protected from a 1,000-year flood, if it floods, you can still get sued. But it puts you, the fact that we are identifying these issues, we're thinking about it, we're recommending alternatives to clients, this puts you on a much better footing if there is a lawsuit. So how is that standard of care tested? Assuming that we don't have a contract clause, elevated standard of care provision that says you're going to guarantee a project outcome, you're going to do the very best job possible, put your client's interests first. Assuming that we have that common law standard of care provision, that language that shows up in your AIA agreement, if you're using those, and I recommend that you do because they're great agreements. It's factually intensive. It is expert driven. When I talked earlier about the battle of the experts, this is where it happens. The common law standard of care. What would another reasonable architect do? Well, that's where we can now have this fight, and that's where we want to be in this. All right, and that is going to be factually intensive. It's going to focus on what you did and when you did it and what you relied on and was it reasonable, and based on the current information currently available. So we're gonna, if you've ever been through a claim, I don't know of anybody who's enjoyed it. It's a terrible process, but you get sued, you turn it over to your, or even before you get sued, if you know it's coming, you report it to your carrier, you report it to your broker, who reports it to your carrier. And when a lawsuit is filed, or if you receive a subpoena, that's basically a court order. There could be a lawsuit that doesn't involve you, maybe between a contractor and an owner, and you get a piece of paper from an attorney that says, give me all your project files. By the way, report that to your broker. Have your carrier open a loss prevention file. It should be no cost to you. But if that happens, the other side's going to be looking for all of your reports, your studies, everything that you did, your calculations. They're going to want to get their hands on it. And if we're in litigation and you're a defendant in a case, you've got to turn that stuff over. Now, you want to get a lawyer involved. We want to have the benefit of the attorney-client privilege. Sometimes these document demands and these subpoenas can be way, way, way overbroad. So don't just respond to them on your own. One of the things that we would do as attorneys is really dial back the scope on those. But my point being is virtually everything can be turned over to the other side. Everything that you did, all of your emails, all of your text messages, even the ones that have been deleted, if the other side is motivated enough to hire a forensic expert and start digging around on hard drives, or network drives. These things, you've got to turn all of this over. Everything that's not privileged. It's privileged if you have conversations with your attorney that you've engaged to provide legal services, for example. You might have to answer written questions, and you might actually have to sit for a deposition where you sit in an office or a court reporter's office and you testify under penalty of perjury, under oath, as if you were sitting in a courtroom. It's a serious, serious ordeal. And they're going to ask you questions about what you did and when you did it and what did you rely on. And they're going to try to pick apart what you did. And they're going to try to make it look like you were careless or you were stupid. And again, tempering myself. I don't want to sound like I'm being too negative here, but I've been through this process enough. So how you document things is really, really important. And if you're using, for example, the Resilience Design Toolkit off the AIA website, don't just save that URL, print that to a PDF. This is what I used on my project when I designed it in 2023. That document, a lot of the documents that are out there may change over time. When the AIA is referencing certain models, those models are going to change over time. There are new models that may come out. NVIDIA, the chip maker, video game maker, has gotten into the AI space when it comes to climate modeling. They're developing tools. So we're in this point where it's just rapidly, rapidly evolving. But you shouldn't be held to the standard of what somebody 2 years from now would have done. So make sure you're documenting these things, you're hanging on to them. The burden of proof, it's a preponderance of the evidence in a civil case. In terms of your reasonableness, all you have to be is 51% more reasonable than not. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a criminal standard. That's where you need to land on this. So when a jury is sitting there saying, wow, did this architect, was that really reasonable, relied on these models? It's just a little bit more than not. It's a fairly low standard, and we want to make sure that we can support you in that. When I say we, I mean the insurance industry, your defense counsel. We want to make sure that we can bolster that case that you did everything that complied with the standard of care. What would a reasonable architect do? And as you're going through the design process, as you're talking to clients and you're thinking about the standard of care analysis, not just, first and foremost, so we can have projects that are successful and stand the test of time and have happy clients, but also in that rare case where we actually get sued later on down the line. And it may become less rare because we don't really know what's exactly going to happen with the climate, aside from getting worse. But you need to be asking yourself, in the resilient design space, are climate trends changing? Are society beliefs about climate trends changing? And is the science evolving? I think the answer to all those questions is yes. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about identifying the problem. We've probably got about 30 minutes or so left in this program because I want to save some time for Q&A. So natural hazard risk. When we think about natural hazard risk, we're talking about a function of hazard and exposure and vulnerability. So this is what I've done is I've just created sort of a fictional claim, but this really happened in terms of natural hazard risk. Lake Charles, Louisiana, it got hit by Hurricane Laura. It was a Cat 4 hurricane, Category 4 hurricane in August of 2020. It then got hit by a Category 2 hurricane in October, a couple months later. What are the chances of that happening? Well, it did happen. What's not on this slide is in, I believe it was February of the next year, that would be 2021. What also happened was Lake Charles was hit with 14-degree weather. It was more than 30 degrees Fahrenheit below average. So, and then what else was going on at that point in time? COVID was happening. So you have all of these different catastrophes hitting this one town at the same time. Two hurricanes that were fairly substantial, a Cat 4 and a Cat 2. You had a deep freeze and you had COVID impacting all of this. So when we think about resilience and the ability to recover, I also want you to think about the other factors that can sort of compound that risk. Rarely do we have just one thing that happens. I know that we're not, I wasn't going to talk about earthquake risk, for example, but that is, in terms of resilience, we see a lot going on in that design space when it comes to seismic risk and earthquakes. Think about if we are in a place where the California fires are raging, power is going out, air quality is horrible, and we have an earthquake. That can really frustrate the ability for a community to recover. That can really undermine resilience initiatives. So be thinking about these things, and like this slide here. So what are the chances? We think about hazard, right? It's frequency and severity. What are the chances of a hurricane hitting the same city twice in 1 year? I don't know what those chances are. There is a chance, and it actually happened. The exposure is looking at the physical properties of the structure or the site. And I use this, and you'll see this in some of the AIA documents as well when it talks about resilience. My design called for backup power. And this is a hospital. I'm just using this because hospitals can be very costly if they're taken offline. Think about all the diagnostic tests and everything that goes into the procedures that a hospital does on a daily basis. You got your backup power in the basement or the first floor, and we have flooding that happens. That's going to knock that out, and that's going to take a lot longer for this facility to recover. Back when Superstorm Sandy hit in New York, we have an office in Lower Manhattan, and same thing happened. All of the equipment was on the first floor of the basement. It all flooded. That building was offline for at least 6 months, maybe more. And part of the reason that building could not come online earlier was because so many other buildings were taken offline. So when we think about resilience, don't just think about it in terms of this one structure. How long does it take for me to rebuild my house if it burns down? Well, it's a lot longer if an entire community burns down, like Coffey Park in Santa Rosa, for example. You're looking at contractor shortages and supply shortages. These things can really frustrate it. And then when we think about the vulnerability, the destruction rates, it's a function of hazard and exposure. What's the cost in terms of property damage and business interruption when we have a hospital that's offline? So yes, if you've got flooding in a hospital, the property damage, you've got mold, you've got all these things that you do to remedy that. Hopefully you can even find a contracting crew who can do the work in a relatively short period of time. But we've also got to be thinking about the business interruption. And that could be tens of thousands, depending on the hospital, $100,000 a day. A predecessor company that I was at, we actually wrote the property policy on a hospital in Joplin, Missouri. And I think it was back in about 2015. I don't expect you to have heard of Joplin, Missouri, but it got wiped out by a tornado. That was $1 billion hospital. Construction cost on the original hospital is fairly new, was $1 billion. So we can really start to rack up costs quickly. And when you start throwing in $100,000 a day or whatever it is for business interruption, these claims start to get massive, and they start to get massive pretty fast. So as you're thinking about resilience and resilient design, I don't want you to just think about, well, I did everything right, it's not my problem. I want you to also be thinking about the fact that if there is a disaster, how does it get paid? That's what we talk about in claims. We talk about liability, we talk about damages. Who did what wrong, how bad is it? But we also talk about how does it get paid? And your policy covers a whole lot of stuff. A professional liability policy covers a lot of different exposures, way more than a general liability policy for a contractor. And if we are looking at a time where property carriers are pulling back, safety net policies, NFIP, state policy, backstops are being shrunken and offering less coverage, this just means that your policy might be more exposed. It's another potential pocket to pick. So breaking this down a little bit, thinking about the standard of care from hazard identification. Think about the trend of increasing severity of climate events. Certainly in California, we're looking at a couple things. Sea level rise is impacting impacting the Bay Area, impacting a lot of our communities along the coast. We have a lot of urban centers that are right by the coast or in bays. The Bay Area is a prime example, and there's a lot of concern focused right now on the Bay Area. What do we do when the sea level rises 6 inches, 12 inches? We start to get these storm surges. We start to get king tides that might correspond with storm surges, that might correspond at a certain point in the spring with a high runoff. We didn't get that this year, not yet, not like it could have been. All of a sudden, you might have low-lying areas. Think about Hayward, Newark, Foster City that are now at real risk of flooding. Those issues are real. There was a report that just came out, I think it's in the process of being published by the U.S. Geological Survey, saying that if we keep doing what we're doing right now, globally, in terms of carbon emissions and atmospheric carbon emissions, by 2100, something like 2/3 of California beaches will be gone. Now, that's not just unfortunate if you like going to the beach, but that's going to drastically increase coastal erosion along those areas. We also think about drought and water stress that are impacting California. Water stress is really that it's like drought, but that's the impact or the need that people have. You might not have a drought, but if we overdevelop a place, there might not be enough water. We're seeing that right now in some of the outer lying areas, sort of east of Scottsdale, Arizona, in the Phoenix Valley, where communities have been built, and they've been built on the promise of water coming from a different water agency that now can no longer deliver that water. So far, that hasn't happened on a wide scale, but there are homes that don't have water. There are homes in California in the Central Valley that do not have clean water. They have to truck water in. I think around Porterville that is happening. So these issues are real, and they're happening. Certainly now, this year we've had a tremendous amount of rainfall and snowpack, but that doesn't really take us. We are, I think, 1,200 years into a drought or some crazy number. It doesn't necessarily pull us out of that. From the metrics that we look at from a state standpoint, most of the state is out of drought, certainly out of extreme drought, but we're still dealing with these climate swings that are going to give us super hot, intense periods with little rainfall, little precipitation, followed by these times we're going to have way too much rain, way more than we know what to do with it. And the concern is we're going to have mega flooding as well. And for those of us in California, we can think about some of the landslides and these things that happened as well, just over the last couple of months. So your ability to sort of identify those hazards. In the Resilience Design Toolkit that the AIA has, they actually have a slide on there or a page in that toolkit that talks about these different models that are out there and how they fit into the design process. Take a look at those. You don't have to nail it. You don't have to be right. You just need to be projecting these things. You need to be forecasting them. You need to be issue spotting, for lack of a better term. And then, failure to properly identify the exposure and design for it. So it's what are we doing along those lines to actually figure out what do we need to do as a society to design for that. I'm going to speed this up a little bit because I am running just a tad short on time. And you will have access to this, a PDF of this program if anybody wants it. So contact Sarah after the program. So what are some of the factors that can make this worse for design professionals? Well, we've talked about failing infrastructure, deferred maintenance, something that we've been pretty good at, not just here in California, but nationwide. We just don't want to fund these projects until it's too late, ends up costing more money. These are look at what happened with PG&E and their failing infrastructure and the fires that it caused. That also happened at a time where the forests were incredibly dry. I think at the time of that fire, or certainly now, there was something like over 100 million dead trees in California. and many of those up in the Sierra Nevada that were wiped out by pine beetle, and those pine beetles were able to proliferate due to warmer winters, and the frost was not killing them off or checking their population. So you have all these things, and less precipitation, and everything's getting dried out. So just because we have failing infrastructure, deferred maintenance, it's also what's happening around us at this point in time. We've also got to be thinking about some of the public projects we work on. Now, many of our firms, that is their bread and butter. All they do is they work with public clients, and that is fine, and you can do that. You can make money doing it. There's nothing wrong with it, but I will tell you from our claim data, looking at the tens of thousands of claims that we've analyzed, public projects tend to be about 30% more costly than a private project. One of the reasons for that, and there's multiple reasons, one of them is this notion of governmental immunity. When we are contracting with the government agency, municipality, the state, there is a certain level of immunity that they have, immune from civil litigation. They can be sued. There's certain things that you have to do that, but just making a mistake as a municipality or a city or a state agency doesn't necessarily mean that you can get sued. So keep that in mind. We definitely can see this with the federal government, who enjoys fairly broad governmental immunity. So for firms that are working on federal projects, for example, if something goes haywire, the government gets sued. First off, they're going to tender that claim to you under the terms of their contract, but they're probably not going to be that deep pocket that would exist in a regular private project. So in terms of when I talked about thinking about claims, not just who did what wrong and how bad is it, but how do these things get paid? If we don't have everybody to the table to contribute to a settlement, it just creates more pressure on everybody else who's in the case. Is that fair or no? But if you've been to a mediation, especially a mediation where there's a high damage case, you might sit down at the very beginning and the mediator comes in and they say, well, how much insurance do you have? They just write it down. Each party, how much do they have? That's what happened with the Millennium Tower. When they settled that case, mediator came in and said, well, how much insurance do you have? Wait a minute, I installed the windows on this project, right? Like what? Because that project took over $100 million to settle, somewhere in that range. I don't remember what it was, but it was reported. That is public. So when I'm talking about these issues, I want you to be thinking, how does this get paid for? You can work on public projects, but if you're going to do that, just be mindful that we're increasing our best practices. Think about this increase in uninsured and underinsured property losses. Now, the United States is fairly well insured. We certainly have requirements if you own a mortgage, if you have a mortgage. What you saw, though, is people pay off their mortgage and they get rid of their homeowners. This is their asset. Think about some of the folks who are at retirement age. They had a 30-year fixed mortgage. They paid it off. The bank said, hey, great, we're good. They got rid of that, $2,000 a month or excuse me, a year, whatever it was. It's probably more now. They don't have to pay that anymore. Well, that is their asset. And if something goes wrong and they can pit it on somebody else, they're going to be looking for compensation. And again, that goes into the bucket of, wow, something bad happened to somebody who's a good person that made a bad decision not to insure their property. That's a hard case to win, even though you may not have done anything right. We're definitely seeing, think back to that slide I showed you with Hurricanes Maria, Irma that happened in the Caribbean. Some of the property losses there, a lot of those property losses were uninsured or underinsured. So, and oddly, it almost seems counterintuitive. The way to combat that is to have more insurance, have more people buying policies. But what we're seeing in the United States is certainly, when I talked about New Orleans, you got carriers, homeowners carriers pulling out of that region. Folks just don't have insurance, or you're seeing these policies being re-underwritten. We're going to lower the limit of insurance that is payable on these claims. That's what the NFIP does as well. So just because you have insurance doesn't mean that it is enough. I suspect in California, we may see more than State Farm and Allstate exit these markets, property markets, and other carriers may come in and fill that gap. It remains to be seen. But as I tell people, when we look at insurance companies, as carriers, we're agnostic. We just care about the science and the math. The actuaries look at these, the pricing actuaries look at these risks and say, does it pencil out or not? So because carriers are leaving markets, they're not trying to punish people. They're looking at it and say, we cannot make any money doing this. And what we're finding in California, given some of the regulations, is carriers are capped at how much they can raise their rates. Nobody wants to pay a lot for insurance, but what that's doing is it is encouraging carriers to get out of the market altogether. That's going to create a lot of stress on communities where people either have to have a mortgage, they have to have a homeowner's policy because they have a mortgage, or they find themselves in a situation where they can't get insurance. They live up in, Truckee, for example, and they're at, elevated fire risk. What if another fire comes through like Coffee Park in San Jose and burns down a community? Who planned that community, right? What did you do to mitigate this? Why did you have a bigger fire break? Why weren't these trees cut down? Is that going to make a difference? Maybe or maybe not. But that brings into this whole notion of attribution science. That's basically using modeling to say, well, what would have happened if these things didn't happen? You can pull them out, for example. So had the design professional factored this into their design, had they increased, the green space between the development and the forest, would it still have burned down? In many cases it would have, but that's where we can start factoring this in, and it can cut both ways. I also threw in here the failure of climate change class action lawsuits. Those were lawsuits, and we saw a number of these that were filed to hold polluters accountable, some of the petrochemical groups. When those lawsuits fail, there was a pot of money. And now if that pot of money is no longer there, it can very well shift that to other organizations, and for folks who are designing and constructing communities that that suffer catastrophe losses, this can create exposure. Social inflation is another issue that we are seeing, and that social inflation, you may have heard about it. That is really this concept that society is becoming accustomed to large numbers. Things are costing more. We certainly saw juries during the pandemic really punishing corporations in their in litigation, and it sort of corresponds with this reptile theory that it's called, that these two attorneys, Keenan and Ball, pioneered going back 5, 7, 8 years ago, where we are now pitching these high damage cases, mostly in the wrongful death bodily injury case context, but pitching these high damage cases as if you as a jury don't punish these people, these same bad things are going to happen to you. And what we're seeing is this massive increase in jury verdicts and settlements. To give you an idea, back I think in 2020, there was a case that went to trial in Corpus Christi, Texas. And in that case, it was drunk driver, a bar patron left a bar, they were driving drunk, they struck another car and killed 2 people. Case went to trial. The verdict on that was $301 billion. That's ridiculous. $301 million is ridiculous. $31 million is probably extreme, but and they'll never get that money, and it'll be overturned on appeal. But my point being that you have people, all walks of life, sitting in a jury box saying, yeah, let's punish these people. Social inflation, reptile theory, these things are real, and it may be a matter of time before we start to see these things pulling in some of these climate action suits as well. Litigation funding is something, seen more of that in other parts of the country, in Florida, where private equity will come in and fund a case. They'll fund all of the costs of the case in exchange for a cut of the payout, just like some of the plaintiff attorneys are going to get a certain percentage. Litigation funding, that is the same concept to that. And if somebody comes in and they say, hey, we think this case is a winner, here's a community that burned up in a California fire. I don't think they had to do that with PG&E and the Camp Fire, but you could see where all of a sudden we could have climate-related litigation, catastrophe losses that are now being funded by third parties. And currently, I don't believe there's any law against it in California. The debate comes more down to, do you have to disclose it? And then, like the example I gave with the bar in Corpus Christi, Texas, you have juries that may not understand. You have judges that don't get it. They don't appreciate the complex issues of causation and damages in design. They don't understand the role of a design professional. You might have somebody pitching to a jury that basically an email or a text message was sufficient to change the program requirements on a project. That's not how we handle change on projects. I don't know anybody who would say that's sufficient, but all of a sudden we get these things out there, and now that's getting introduced into evidence, and people, they don't understand it. And now we're relying on a battle of the experts and how that works. So there's a lot of little things that can factor in your your sort of daily practice, how you manage your risk that can blow a claim out of proportion. So enough with the negativity here. I want to offer up a few solutions. I'm going to get through this probably in the next 10 minutes so we can have some questions and answers. I do see we have some questions in the Q&A box. I don't want people to come out of this webinar and think, wow, I'm going to get out of this business altogether. I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is scary. The vast majority of your projects are going to work out fine. Even the projects that wind up in claim territory, 1 to 2% are actually going to go to trial. So we're talking about very, very little. Now, you want to make sure that that does happen. You've done everything you can to protect yourself. But you can also be part of the solution as well. So some of the things that we can be doing, in addition to attending these types of webinars, to engaging with your industry groups like the AIA, offering to design beyond code compliance to minimize interruption, maximize speed of catastrophe. So looking at these historic baselines, think about our FEMA flood maps. Very risky. We don't want to be using those maps to design projects prospectively, certainly in specific parts of the United States, or even FEMA will say, yeah, our maps are kind of out of date, but use that as a starting point. I talk to a lot of design professionals who use that as a basis. They are using, for example, some of the locally available information. They might look at rainfall data over the last 20 years. Well, it doesn't really, we've got these extreme weather events. How does that impact what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Well, they're making some educated guesses. If they're not using some of the models that are out there, and we're seeing more of the models, sort of locally available hazard models that are out there. If they're not using those, then what they're doing is they're saying, okay, I'm going to take the 3 worst years of heat or drought or rainfall, and I'm going to extrapolate that out. Is that going to be exact? No, but it's a pretty good place to start, and you're doing something. I was talking to these engineers recently, and they said, look, and this is a firm that does a lot of forensic work. They do a lot of expert witness work. And what I find is a lot of times our engineers they want to wait for the perfect model that is proven to be 100% accurate before they use it. And we're just not there yet. And the science is constantly evolving. And these engineers said, look, we've got these communities in basically a floodplain. We're going to add 12 to 18 inches of freeboard. And you can model that, what does it mean? But at the end of the day, it is better than nothing. It's going to mitigate some of the floods that they're going to have. Some of the things we can be doing is providing design alternatives. For some of the larger clients, and I see this happen more on the public side. They say, okay, we're putting this project out to bid. So here are the RFP. We're looking for requests for proposal, and here are the program requirements. If you change anything, you're out of the running. Well, sometimes it's coming up with an alternative design that can help provide, help inform that process. And talking to your clients about life cycle. In the documents that the AIA has come out with, they give you a lot of talking points to go through that life cycle analysis. Some of our firms, and this is more the larger firms, are hiring experts either internally or as sub-consultants. I think about one of our, and I don't expect firms to necessarily do this, but I want to let you know it is happening. One of the, a large civil firm that we work with, they do a lot of port and harbor work. They've actually retained a climatologist, someone who has a PhD, to help understand how our rising sea levels and storm surge is going to impact the projects that they're designing, at ports and harbors around the United States and around the world. The AIA, they have a sustainability, you can become a sustainability consultant. The C204 talks about that. And then the E204 has the sustainable projects exhibit. You don't have to do that. Now, this is a direction that some firms are going, they're getting trained up on it. But just to be able to recommend to a client, here are the issues you need to think about, and we think this is an adequate consultant. We think this, you need to hire somebody who does this type of work, or maybe you can recommend somebody to do that. You might want to recommend somebody to do that if they need to be under your contract. But knowing that, the industry is moving in this direction, these are some of the things that we can do. And then just getting involved in some of the discussions. I talked about decarbonization and resilience. I know that in Denver, Colorado, for example, the city is really pushing to decarbonize. And we've got some of our engineering firms that are involved with ACEC are having these conversations. Wait, pump the brakes, folks. What does this mean to your hospital? What does this mean to your infrastructure? What does this mean? And where is your energy coming from? Really asking these questions, not because they don't want to do it, but because, like architects, they have a health, safety, and welfare obligation as well. And it's important that they're meeting those requirements and meeting those standards. Some of the factors that are driving the change that we're seeing, certainly the infrastructure funding that is starting to trickle down. We're starting to see more projects with federal funding, state and municipal projects. We're seeing a lot more of these localized open source hazard modeling tools that are out there. They're available for you. I can't, and again, there's a risk when you use any of this stuff, but they're available. You can start using these tools. Well, what if I used a tool and it's not perfect and maybe it gave me a result that was wrong? At the end of the day, absent that elevated standard of care provision in your contract, if this is what another reasonable architect would do, then I think you're in a pretty good place. Now, the winds are going to change in Washington, D.C. It's going to go back and forth. But what we are seeing is, from a shareholder standpoint, the ESG requirements are taking hold in the private industry. And I think that's going to be here to stay. And those requirements are trickling down to some of our design firms. You've got to be mindful of that. You've got, if you're obligated to comply with an owner's ESG requirements, you need to know what those are. You need to know that you can do it. You need to know that any subs that you hire can comply. But just keep in mind, this is changing the industry, just like some of the lender requirements. When we think about resilience, think about some of these large commercial lenders. You might have a lender who has, $1 billion portfolio of hospitality projects along the Eastern Seaboard that is exposed to sea level rise. They want to know what's going to happen to their projects in 25 years, what's going to happen to these properties. So you're starting to see, organizations like CREFC, the Commercial Finance Real Estate Council, really starting to drive some of these requirements. And then obviously just shifting societal norms. We are in a different place now than we were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. The conversation is happening. People are getting on board with it. There is interest in it. I think back to when I was in college in the early 90s, they were talking about these issues in my environmental studies classes, but it wasn't gaining any traction really in society. Well, it is now, because we've suffered a number of extreme catastrophe losses, and we're going to have more. So the conversation is happening. What are some of the things that we can do? I talked about communicating and documenting. It's absolutely imperative. Sometimes, we've got to deliver bad news to our clients, so we need to be upfront about budget and schedule and quality. We can't just pitch these resilient designs without being transparent about what it might cost, and the quality, if there's a different quality of materials that are being used. The AIA Hazard and Climate Risk, a user's guide and form for acknowledging risk, is a phenomenal document. Take a look at it. It's under that resilience tab on the AIA website. It helps you identify these hazards. It helps you have that conversation with your client. And the thing that I really like about this document, I thought I printed it up and maybe I don't, here it is. At the end of this, what it does is it has a place for all your project stakeholders to sign off on. Everybody's got to initial this or sign it, understanding they're on board with this. And it includes lenders, owner's insurance broker, owner's provided consultants. So what we're really trying to do, and this is less about protecting ourselves from liability, it's more about making sure that we're having this conversation and people are thinking about it. I know a lot of times I talk about these things and it's like, aha, this is going to help you if you get sued. Well, it's also going to help get the project completed and have a successful project as well. And if they look at this and they say, well, no way am I getting my broker to sign this, or no way am I getting that's fine. That's okay. At least you had that conversation and you're putting that document out there. Sometimes it is, when we think about communicating a document, it's rephrasing the conversation. I have some of our firms who are talking about 1,000-year events from a probability standpoint. The concern is, if a 1,000-year event happens, a layperson is going to say, well, we're good now for another 999 years. And that's not how probability works. And then just documenting, to help build that case for the standard of care. It takes extra time and effort out of your day. But what did you do? What did you rely on? Think about some of your material data sheets. Hopefully you're printing those to a PDF, information that you have from a manufacturer's website. Hopefully you print that to a PDF, because manufacturers will change that, especially if they get sued over a product that's not working. but you're building that project file of what are the things that I relied on. Some folks will say, well, can't that hurt me? Can't I get sued? Well, yeah, if you don't, if you miss something, that's a problem. But the vast majority of our firms, when they're doing that, they are helping themselves. And then you can also protect yourself contractually. Now, these are just chapters that we have in our contract guide. You may have a contract guide with your own carrier. Whatever it is, it's just clearly defined scope, a reasonable schedule. We want to make sure we're disclaiming certifications, guarantees, and warranties for things that are beyond our control. I hope I've hit standard of care over the head enough times already, but that's really important. If you're going to incorporate a code, let's talk about, the code that's in effect, either reference the code or in effect at a certain point in time, or the code in effect at the date this contract was signed or fully executed. I see sometimes our design professionals get hung up on code changes. They said they were going to comply with the building code, and yet there were changes, and the way that was worded in their contract is a little loose. I've always been a little concerned about our firms who have these open-ended redesign obligations. That's a fact of life in a lot of our contracts. And if you're out in the field and you see something wrong, yes, you're probably going to go back to the office and come up with a plan revision. That's okay. I'm more concerned about some of the big ticket items where if you say, look, I'm going to provide the owner with a construction cost estimate, and if the lowest construction bid comes in over the cost estimate, I'll redesign the project for free. And that's not insurable, by the way. That's money that comes out of your own pocket. And if we're talking about some of these issues that are happening with resilient design, if the owner comes back, or the cost can't get there, cost escalation, labor shortages, that's just as another added concern for you. Two other provisions, and I just want to hit this briefly, and we'll wrap it up here. Resilient design. This is a chapter from our contract guide. We developed this in conjunction with one of our firms who said, it was a firm that does a lot of port and harbor work. We're really concerned about coming up with designs, knowing that the future may change and our design may be rendered, deficient at some point in the near future. And again, this goes to just setting that stage, having that conversation, estimating, projecting future weather, climate, rainfall. It's difficult, it's complex, it's based on variable assumptions beyond our control. This is, we're doing this based on data that's currently available, and it may change. Really just trying to manage expectations on that. That also comes with a hold harmless and indemnity. Now, some folks may say, well, my client's never going to sign that. At least we are having the conversation. While that doesn't factor into your agreement and can't be introduced as a contract term if we go to trial, what you can probably do is to say, if the client says, you never told me about these issues, well, now we can use these negotiations, at least from the standpoint of what we call impeachment evidence. Yeah, we did talk about it. Yes, this is not a provision in our contract, but we talked about it because you crossed it out and sent it back to me and said, no way did you want to sign it. Now, that doesn't get you out of a lawsuit, but these things can help in the event of a claim. We have a chapter on innovative design and technologies that may or may not apply to this. I've run a little bit over. And I just wanted to sort of end on this slide here in terms of what we're doing as a carrier. And this is not here to sell our services, but the quote that I want to leave you with is up here in red. 4 degrees centigrade is not insurable. That came from our president back in a couple of years ago, Thomas Buberl. And what he's talking about is that a global temperature of 4 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels is not insurable. Currently, we're on track for 3.2 degrees centigrade. Now, I've already talked about a couple carriers in California pulling out. What this basically means is the climate is going to be so unpredictable that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for us to insure property. So with that, I will turn it over to any questions that we might have. And Sarah, I'll maybe let you moderate that.
Hi, Brett. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have lots of questions. We'll do our best to get through some of these. One question I wanted to start with, someone asked is, how do you foresee AI impacting standard of care in the future?
That is a great question. We've had a number of our insureds and brokers reach out to us and asking us that very question. We're sort of in this exploratory mode right now. AI is here to stay. We certainly can hear horror stories about it, I think it could be a very valuable tool. I made reference earlier how NVIDIA is coming out with a hazard modeling tool that uses artificial intelligence. I think it's going to factor into the standard of care at some point. Some of the hazard models that are out there are not very prospective looking. And I think what we're going to find in the next year or two is some of the hazard models that we might rely on today might be outdated a year from now or 2 years from now based on the AI that is available. So to that extent, should you go out and buy a license for this? Yeah, at some point you may need to. It depends on how much it costs. I think it will factor into the standard of care as those models become more and more accurate.
Great, thank you. We have a few hypothetical questions throughout this too, just to kind of gauge on some advice. So here's one hypothetical, they said not so hypothetical question. Owner and contractor come up with an idea to slightly change a design. Maybe it puts it a little bit out of the bounds of the code. They don't want to resign from the job, or they don't want to report it, but it's not that big of a change. It's something that the client would want. What is the reasonable amount of risk to take and the reasonable way to document without dropping a bomb or making it a big deal, I guess, is kind of how the question is worded.
Well, that's a great question. It is a difficult question to answer, and the response that you're going to hate is it depends, and it really depends on because you're right in that gray area right there. This doesn't rise to the level of me calling the building department. How do you feel about it? What is your comfort level on it? And it depends on what that change really is. How does it impact the performance of the building? Does it impact the health and safety of the occupants? Does it impact the cost? I think these things happen a lot. That might be a substitution. It might be something that's value engineered, hopefully much earlier than during construction. But these can definitely, and at the end of the day, if you're signing off on it, this is your design, so you're going to own it. So you have to be comfortable with that. If you're not comfortable with it, you might have to be unpopular on this project. But maybe just having those conversations with the contractor and the owner and trying to figure out, maybe putting yourself at ease. But if it's something that you feel is going to have an adverse impact, then you definitely have to raise that issue with your client. I have had some situations where a firm felt so strongly about it that they weren't ready to walk from the project, but they basically said, all right, owner, we'll do it, but here, and we talked to our attorney, here is a waiver and indemnity. You waive any claims against us arising out of this change, and you're going to defend and indemnify us from any third-party lawsuits that might arise out of this change. Most clients will not sign that. It'll give them a little bit of pause. Now, do you still go forward with that? Or are you kind of setting yourself up? Well, if they say no, do I still do it? That's up to you in terms of how you want to proceed with it. But sometimes just raising, here's my concern. I feel so strongly about it. It's building that narrative. If something goes wrong, I stood at the top of the mountain and I jumped up and down and I told you not to do it. That is a constant theme that I would see in claims. You didn't object hard enough. Save me from myself. There was a mediator I used to work with up in Seattle, Chris Selling, who called it the stop me before I kill again defense. You have to stop me before I do something bad. So think about that. Are you jumping up and down and really connecting the dots? Apologize for the long-winded answer, but sometimes it's not enough just to say, hey, we recommend you don't do that. Contractor wants to do it. They've had a conversation with the owner. Seems like a good idea, but sometimes you have to connect the dots. If you do this, these are the bad impacts that may result. It's health and safety, it's cost, it's schedule, it's program requirements, functionality, whatever it is, and really documenting that. We recommend you don't do it, but we'll do it this time, or we'll only do it if you agree to, waive any claims and indemnify it. So I think and if you're starting to get into that point where you really don't feel comfortable about it, I would recommend you talk to your broker about it. It might be something that rises to the level of reporting this to your carrier as a circumstance, not a claim. But if so, they might be able to retain counsel to help you draft that response. Sarah?
Perfect, thank you. Another question, is it fair to understand standard of care as a method to protect against the expectation that perfection is not possible when designing a project? If so, is there a reasonable quantifiable boundary, example, dollar value, for a potential claim associated with a project's construction cost, such as a certain percentage of construction cost in order to correct or complete the construction of a project?
That is a, I'm glad you raised that issue, whoever that person is. I've always resisted that. Now we can say, for example, there's a lot of discussion around this issue. Look, no project is perfect. There might be a certain number of change orders that are okay, but say 2% or I don't know 3% of your construction values. Anything within that is okay. Now, if you sign a contract and you say, okay, if the construction values fall within 3% or less, owner's going to pay that and they can't sue me for anything that might have gone wrong. Well, a couple things. Some of those might be your fault. And if you sign something like that, what you've done is you potentially violated or breached the contractual liability exclusion in your policy. You have a contractual requirement that says anything above 3% is now compensable. And the concern with that is there might be a mistake that causes a 5% or a 10% increase in construction costs. That doesn't necessarily mean that what you did fell below the standard of care. Some clients really push for this certainty up front. They want to know. And I think it's more about trying to budget for these things. I never want to see your policy used as a contingency fund on a project, but sometimes clients say, look, I've got $100 million and I can come up with $105 million if need be for this project. Well, just because something exceeds a certain amount, if you agree that it is a breach of the standard of care and it's not, you might take yourself out of coverage. So there's danger in doing that. I prefer not to do it.
Great. Next question. Architects have been advised to stay away from assigning typical values to E&O related to standard of care, 2 to 5% for new construction, less than 15% for remodel, as a strategy for arguing that the owner used their contingency prior to finding the AE at fault. Can you provide insight as to why this might not be a good strategy?
Read that one more time, Sarah.
Sure.
I just want to make sure I understand this.
Architects have been advised to stay away from assigning typical values to E&O related standard of care, 2 to 5% for new construction, less than 15% for remodel, as a strategy for arguing that the owner used their contingency prior to finding the architect or engineer at fault. Can you provide insight into why this may not be a good strategy?
Well, the contingency is it's not, the contingency fund has to be used correctly, and hopefully there's a design contingency and a construction contingency as well. There are change orders that are going to come up. Some of those may apply, a contingency may apply to those. Some of them may be a contractor issue as well. So I think it's kind of similar to the last question. I sort of resist locking you into a certain amount or a dollar amount or a percentage. Anything over that amount is an error. I may not be understanding that question correctly though, but I'm happy to follow up on it later.
Sure. And I think I want to just add in one last question because I thought it was kind of helpful for just basic for some of the things you were talking about. What does reasonable mean? That's come up a few different times as a reasonable action. How would you simply define reasonable?
Well, and that's kind of the thing that a lot of people struggle with. Reasonable is an objective standard, and it goes back to what would someone else in this industry do? When you say, well, that doesn't really help me very much, Brett. Again, I'm looking for sort of a concrete example of what reasonable is. It might be code compliance. It might be something beyond code compliance. This is where we get into that expert-driven analysis. What would an expert, based on somebody who does forensic work? Now, you don't always have the ability to consult with an expert ahead of doing, designing a project. So it is a loose standard. And this is where I think a lot of people have trouble getting their head around it. Well, what does it mean to be a reasonable architect? It is what would, as you sit in this chat room, or if you're at an event, an AI event with your peers, it's these conversations that you have. What are the things that you might be doing? It is a loose standard, and I wish there was a way to quantify it more, but we don't have that. And I know that some of our engineers, when we interact with them, they say, well, wait a minute, code compliance, I met the code, that's reasonable. Well, yeah, and that might meet the standard of care, but not always. You might do everything that is reasonable under the code, but you should have done more. If you wind up in a claim situation, somebody's going to be saying you should have done more. Is that reasonable for them to say that? Could you have done more? Think about the comment that I made a few moments ago, responding to a question. Were you standing at the top of the mountain, jumping up and down, warning your client that if they undertake a certain course of action is a bad idea by drawing a line to all the different adverse impacts that might happen? And I use that as an example because I would see it so many times in our claims where architect says, you know, they're going through a value engineering process and they say, okay, we're going to cut out you're going to change some of the furnishings, we're going to change the tile, we're going to change the siding, we're going to change the we're going to cut out some of your site observations. One of those is not like the others, and it doesn't help you to say, well, we object to that, we don't think it's a good idea. We don't think it's a good idea to delete our site observations services under our scope, because when we are on a project during construction, that's the time where we can understand if something doesn't comply in the field, we can get in front of it. It costs less to the owner. It takes less time. We avoid delays, schedule slippage, all those different things. So it's connecting those dots. And then, you know, and I'm kind of going a little far afield here, then that burden would shift back to the owner if we were in litigation to say, well, is it reasonable? Was what you did in terms of ignoring that architect reasonable? So it's what, you know, at the end of the day, and I didn't say this earlier and I should have said it, at the end of the day, the standard of care is, what is a jury going to believe? Unfortunately, that's what it is. So the reasonable standard is, and that's what gives our design professionals a lot of pause. It is constantly evolving and it's based on what a reasonable person would do. And I wish I could be more exact than that.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett, for your whole presentation. This was great. And thank you everyone for participating and very active in the chat and the Q&A. If you've made it this far, AIA California will submit you for AIA credit. It may take a couple weeks before those credits reflect your transcript. And as always, be on the lookout in your email for upcoming notifications of other AIA webinars. And thank you again, Brett, so much, and everybody for attending. And we'll see you at our next AIA California webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Brett. Fantastic.